Silent arrival. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Manhattan Supreme Courthouse as Madeline Carter stood at the entrance, clutching a small ivory-colored package against her chest, and her heart hammered so loudly she wondered if the reporters clustered near the fountain could hear it. But she kept her face calm and walked forward with measured steps that belied the storm raging inside her. She wore a simple navy dress that skimmed her knees, and her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, revealing the elegant line of her neck and the slight paleness of her skin that came from too many sleepless nights. And the marble floors echoed with each click of her modest heels as she made her way through the grand hallway, past the curious stares of lawyers and court officials who whispered behind their hands. Alexander Blake was already inside courtroom 7B, surrounded by his team of 5 attorneys, dressed in sharp Italian suits and their leather briefcases lined up like soldiers ready for battle. And he sat at the defendant's table with his jaw set and his steel gray eyes fixed on the door, waiting for her arrival, with the same intensity he brought to every corporate takeover and hostile merger that had made him a legend on Wall Street. When Madeline entered the courtroom, the air seemed to shift, and Alexander felt his breath catch despite himself, because she looked different, somehow, more resolved, more distant, as if she had already moved beyond him into a future he couldn't see. And his lead attorney, Marcus Pemberton, leaned over to whisper something about strategy, but Alexander waved him away, unable to tear his gaze from his wife. She walked alone down the center aisle, carrying nothing but that mysterious package and no briefcase, no files, no lawyer trailing behind her. And the spectators in the gallery craned their necks to get a better view, while the sketch artists furiously worked their pencils across paper, trying to capture this strange moment. Judge Eleanor Richardson, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, looked up from her papers as Madeline approached the bench, and she removed her reading glasses, letting them dangle from the chain around her neck as she studied this young woman who had requested an unusual private hearing with minimal notice, Your Honor. Madeline said softly, and her voice carried through the silent courtroom, despite its gentle tone. I come before you today without legal representation, because what I need to say requires no interpretation or argument. And she held up the package with both hands, as if offering something sacred. I ask only that you open this package here in front of my husband and allow its contents to speak for themselves. Alexander leaned forward, his powerful hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table, and his mind raced through possibilities, wondering what scheme she had devised, what evidence she thought she had. Because in his world, everything was a negotiation, a game of chess where the smartest player won and he had never lost. But something in Madeline's eyes gave him pause, and for the first time in months, he saw past his own pride and wounded ego to recognize the woman he had married 4 years ago in a spring ceremony overlooking the Hudson River, when everything seemed possible and love felt invincible. Judge Richardson gestured for the bailiff to retrieve the package, and the elderly man approached Madeline with careful steps, taking the ivory box from her hands and carrying it back to the bench as if it contained something fragile and irreplaceable, and the entire courtroom held its breath. Madeline returned to stand alone at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded in front of her, and she did not look at Alexander, though she could feel the weight of his stare burning into her profile. And she thought about all the nights she had spent preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, documenting moments, writing letters that poured out her heart. The judge carefully untied the silver ribbon that bound the package and lifted the lid with slow, deliberate movements, and inside lay a stack of papers tied with more ribbon and several sealed envelopes, and a leather journal worn at the edges, and Judge Richardson began to read the top document, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to something deeper. The contents revealed. Judge Richardson lifted the first document from the package, and her voice filled the courtroom as she read aloud the heading, and it said, Legal Declaration of Parental Rights and Financial Security for Unborn Child. And the words hung in the air like thunder, and Alexander felt the blood drain from his face as the meaning crashed over him. Madeline kept her eyes fixed on the wooden rail in front of her, even as she heard the collective gasp from the gallery and the furious whispering of Alexander's attorneys, and she had known this moment would come, had rehearsed it 1,000 times in her mind, But nothing could have prepared her for the reality of standing here, exposed and vulnerable, before the man who had once promised her the world. The judge continued reading, and the document detailed how Madeline had spent the last 4 months quietly establishing a trust fund in the baby's name and securing property rights and setting up educational accounts and every legal protection a mother could think of. And she had done it all without Alexander's knowledge, without his money, using her own inheritance from her grandmother and her savings from her years as a teacher before she married him. Alexander pushed back his chair and stood abruptly, and Marcus grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back down. But Alexander shook him off, and his voice came out rough and broken when he spoke, and he said, "Madeline." And just that one word carried the weight of 1,000 questions and accusations and regrets. But Judge Richardson raised her hand for silence, and she said, "Mr. Blake, you will have your turn to speak, but first we will review all the contents of this package as your wife has requested." And Alexander sank back into his chair, feeling like a man watching his entire world tilt on its axis. The judge picked up the leather journal next, and she opened it carefully, and Madeline closed her eyes because she knew what was written there. And every page was a letter she had written to Alexander over the past 6 months, and letters he had never received because she had never sent them, and each one documented a moment he had missed while building his empire. Judge Richardson began to read selected passages aloud, and her voice softened as she read. Madeline's words in one entry said, "Today I felt our baby move for the first time, and I reached for my phone to call you. But I remembered you were in Tokyo closing the Yamamoto deal, and you had told me not to disturb you with trivial matters, and I sat alone in our bedroom with my hand on my stomach and wondered if you would even care." Alexander felt something crack inside his chest, and he remembered that week in Tokyo and how he had stayed an extra 3 days to celebrate with clients, and how Madeline had called once, and he had sent her to voicemail and told himself he would call back later, but he never did. Another entry described the day Madeline had gone to her first ultrasound appointment alone, and how the technician had asked where her husband was, and Madeline had smiled and made excuses. But inside, she felt the loneliness spread like ice water through her veins, and she had watched the tiny heartbeat fluttering on the screen and cried silent tears that the technician pretended not to see. The courtroom was completely silent now, except for Judge Richardson's voice, and even the court reporter had stopped typing. Momentarily caught up in the raw emotion of these private words being spoken in this public space, and Madeline felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. Marcus Pemberton shuffled papers nervously and whispered to his colleagues, but they had no strategy for this and no legal precedent, and no amount of money could undo the truth being revealed page by page. Judge Richardson set down the journal and picked up a manila envelope marked "Evidence of Neglect and Financial Control." And inside were bank statements showing how Alexander had gradually restricted Madeline's access to their joint accounts, and credit card bills he had questioned, and receipts he had demanded explanations for, and a paper trail of financial manipulation so subtle that Madeline herself hadn't recognized it as abuse until she started documenting everything. Alexander stared at the evidence and wanted to protest that he had only been protecting their assets and being financially responsible, but seeing it all laid out like this, he recognized the pattern and how he had slowly boxed Madeline into dependence. The breaking point. The final envelope in the package was sealed with red wax, and Judge Richardson held it up to the light before breaking the seal, and inside was a single photograph and a handwritten letter. And when the judge looked at the photo, her expression softened in a way that made even the hardened attorneys in the room lean forward with curiosity. The photograph showed Madeline and Alexander on their wedding day, and they were dancing under string lights with the Manhattan skyline glowing behind them. And Alexander's hand was pressed against the small of Madeline's back, and she was laughing with her head thrown back, and the joy radiating from that image was so pure and real that it made the coldness of the present moment even more painful. Judge Richardson began reading the letter aloud, and Madeline's voice echoed in those words, even though someone else was speaking them, and she had written, "My dearest Alexander, and I am writing this letter on the day I discovered I was carrying our child, and my first instinct was to run to you and share this joy, but I stopped myself because I knew what would happen. The letter continued, and Madeline described how she had imagined telling Alexander about the baby and how she had pictured a dozen different scenarios. And in some, he would be working and barely look up from his computer, and in others, he would smile distantly and say something about needing to update their insurance. And in none of her imagined futures did he sweep her into his arms and cry with happiness the way she had always dreamed. Alexander felt his throat tighten, and he wanted to stand up and shout that she was wrong and that he would have been thrilled. But the truth was sitting heavy in his stomach because he knew she was probably right, and he had become so consumed with building and acquiring and winning that he had forgotten how to simply feel. Judge Richardson read on, and the letter detailed how Madeline had spent weeks deciding whether to tell Alexander at all, and how she had finally chosen to use this pregnancy as a catalyst for change, and either they would rebuild their marriage on honest ground or she would secure her child's future and walk away with dignity. And she wrote, "I refuse to raise our baby in a home where love is a scheduled appointment and affection is rationed like a scarce resource." The courtroom felt smaller somehow, and the walls seemed to press in as the weight of Madeline's words settled over everyone present. And one of the younger attorneys on Alexander's team, a woman named Jennifer Davis, wiped at her eyes discreetly, and even Marcus Pemberton had stopped his nervous paper shuffling. Madeline finally turned to look at Alexander, and their eyes met across the courtroom. And in that moment, 4 years of marriage and 6 months of lonely pregnancy and countless nights of crying into her pillow all crystallized into one clear truth. And she still loved him, and she could see in his face that he was finally beginning to understand what he had lost. Alexander stood again, and this time no one tried to stop him, and he took 3 steps toward Madeline before Judge Richardson raised her hand and said, "Mr. Blake, I understand your desire to speak, but there is one more document in this package, and I believe you need to hear it." She pulled out a legal document, and it was a petition, but not for divorce as Alexander had feared, and instead it was a custody agreement and parental rights contract that Madeline had drawn up, and it outlined how they would co-parent their child, and it included provisions for equal decision-making and mandatory family counseling, and scheduled family time that could not be interrupted by business. But what struck Alexander most was the clause at the end, and it said if Alexander Blake can demonstrate through consistent action over a period of 6 months that he is capable of putting family before business and love before ambition and presence before profit, then this agreement can be dissolved and we can attempt to rebuild our marriage. And if he cannot, then I will file for separation with full custody rights already established. Judge Richardson set down the document and removed her glasses, and she looked at Alexander with the weariness of someone who had seen too many marriages crumble in her courtroom, and she said, "Mr. Blake, your wife has not come here to destroy you, and she has come here to save your family. And the question is whether you are capable of being saved." Alexander felt his carefully constructed world crumbling around him, and all the board meetings and the merger deals and the late nights at the office suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless. And he looked at Madeline standing there with one hand unconsciously resting on her still flat stomach, and he saw clearly for the first time the woman he had taken for granted. The reporters in the gallery were scribbling frantically, and the sketch artists were capturing this moment of raw emotion. And Alexander knew that by tomorrow his personal life would be splashed across every business journal and tabloid in the city. But for once, he didn't care about his reputation or his image. Marcus Pemberton stood and cleared his throat, and he began to speak about legal procedures and requesting time to review the documents. But Alexander cut him off, and his voice was rough when he said, "Marcus, sit down, and this isn't about law anymore." He walked slowly toward Madeline, and Judge Richardson watched carefully, ready to intervene if needed. But there was something in Alexander's face that made her pause, and it was vulnerability and fear and desperate hope all mixed together. Alexander stopped a few feet from Madeline, and he said, and his voice cracked, "I didn't know, and I should have known, and I should have seen. And God, Madeline, am so sorry." The reckoning. Madeline looked at Alexander and saw tears forming in his steel-gray eyes for the first time since his father had died 3 years ago, and she had built walls around her heart to survive the loneliness. But seeing him broken like this made those walls tremble, and she wanted to reach out to comfort him. But she forced herself to stay still, because this moment was too important to rush. Alexander ran his hand through his dark hair, and the gesture was so familiar and so achingly reminiscent of the man she had fallen in love with that Madeline felt her resolve waver, and he said, "When did I become this person? And when did I stop seeing you, and really seeing you, and noticing the way you light up when you talk about your students, or how you hum when you cook, or the thousand little things that made me fall in love with you?" Judge Richardson sat back in her chair, and she had presided over hundreds of custody cases and bitter divorces. But this was something different, and this was a marriage teetering on the edge of collapse, but still fighting to survive. And she decided to give them space and said, "I will recess for 20 minutes, and you two need to talk, and really talk." The courtroom emptied slowly, and the attorneys gathered their papers reluctantly, and the spectators filed out whispering excitedly about what they had witnessed, and Marcus Pemberton paused at the door and looked back at Alexander with concern. But Alexander waved him away, and finally they were alone except for the bailiff, who stood discreetly in the corner. Madeline sat down at the plaintiff's table, and her legs suddenly felt weak, and Alexander pulled a chair from his side of the courtroom and placed it facing hers. And he sat down, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. And the silence between them was heavy with 4 years of unspoken words. Alexander spoke first, and his voice was quiet and raw. And he said, "I got the call about the Yamamoto deal on our second anniversary. And do you remember, and I told you I would take you to that restaurant you loved, but then I flew to Tokyo instead. And you said you understood, and you smiled and told me business came first?" Madeline nodded slowly, and she remembered that night and how she had sat alone in their penthouse with a homemade cake and 2 candles, and how she had blown them out by herself and made a wish that Alexander would come home and really come home, not just physically, but emotionally. Alexander continued, and the words seemed to pour out of him now, like a dam breaking, and he said, "My father built Blake Industries from nothing, and he worked 80-hour weeks and missed every school play and baseball game and family dinner. And when he died, the company was worth billions, but I barely knew him, and I swore I would never be like him. But somewhere along the way, I became exactly like him." He leaned forward and his hands were shaking, and he said, "I thought providing for you meant making money and buying you things and securing our future, and I thought that was love, and I thought that was enough, but you needed me, and not my money and not my name, and just me, and I was too blind to see it." Madeline felt tears streaming down her face now, and she had imagined this conversation so many times and practiced what she would say and how she would stay strong. But the reality was messier and more painful and more real than anything she had rehearsed. And she said, "I watched you disappear piece by piece, and every late night at the office, and every canceled dinner, and every time you chose a conference call over a conversation with me, and I felt myself becoming invisible." Alexander reached out tentatively and placed his hand on the table, palm up, and it was an offering and a question. And Madeline stared at his hand and remembered when those hands had held hers during their wedding vows, and when they had traced patterns on her back during lazy Sunday mornings, and when they had slowly stopped reaching for her. At all, she placed her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers with desperate tenderness. And Alexander said, "Our baby, and tell me about our baby. And I want to know everything and every detail I missed." Madeline took a shaky breath, and she said, "I felt the first flutter 3 weeks ago, and it was like butterfly wings inside me. And I was in the grocery store buying apples, and I just stood there in the produce section, crying because it was so beautiful and so lonely. And the doctor says everything looks